Hello, this is David Sloan Wilson for Evolution, This View of Life, the magazine that approaches anything and everything from an evolutionary perspective. In honor of Black History Month, I'm very pleased to be talking with Joseph Graves, an eminent evolutionist who is associated with the National Evolutionary Synthesis Center, among other affiliations. Hello, Joe.
How are you doing, David?
I'm doing great. Pleasure to talk to you in this way. And Joe, we have a bunch of stuff to talk about, but first of all, let me hold up your book here. This is one of your books, The Race Myth: Why We Pretend Race Exists in America. So on the one hand, you say that there's a race myth, and on the other hand, you're an eminent evolutionist, and you know, as well as we all do, that there is such a thing as genetic differentiation, local adaptation. So please tell us about how race can be a myth, even from a sophisticated evolutionary perspective.
Well, it's precisely that sophisticated evolutionary perspective that demonstrates that what most people think of as race is, in fact, myth. The average person on the street does not differentiate between biological definitions of race, which I'll talk about shortly, and social definitions of race. The latter, the social definitions of race, are somewhat arbitrary. They're socially contextual, and they're historically bound. So at the beginning of the United States, there were only two races, and those races were basically Negro or slave and white. But those racial categories changed as the diversity of the United States changed. And so the categories of the census really reflect the socio-political conditions of the time and have really nothing to do with underlying biological variation.
Right.
So now, when we go back and we talk about underlying biological variation and the concept of race, this is, as you know, an essential concept to the speciation mechanisms of evolutionary biologists. We talk about local adaptation, we talk about the development of subspecies, we talk about geographical races, and all of those things are absolutely what you would predict if descent with modification is a real thing.
Right.
So I've often been misquoted in newspapers, magazines, television, as to, the claim that Dr. Graves says there's no such thing as race, and in fact I've never said that. What I've said is that anatomically modern humans, our species, do not show biological races if we use the same criteria that we apply to other large-bodied mammals. And those two criteria that we generally use to determine the existence of race have to do with, one, the amount of genetic variation within purported groups or races versus that between them. And we can measure that in a number of ways. And as I'm sure you know, Sir Wright gave us a series of population subdivision statistics,
right,
which we can use to determine the amount of genetic variation within and between groups. The one that's most salient for this discussion is FST, which is the amount of population subdivision that exists between a total members of the species and its subgroups. And Wright suggested to us that an FST equal to 0.250, and FSTs can go on Wright's scale from 0 to 1, would be sufficient to say that there are subspecies or geographical races within that species. And Wright used that criterion for a reason, because he said, essentially that you had to have at least a FST of 0.250 to assure that there would be fixation at loci, so that one group would be really different from the other. So when we look at that criterion within anatomically modern humans, genome-wide FST is around 0.110. So we don't come close to that differentiation. We do at specific loci, and at ones that you wouldn't surprise you. For example, if you look at skin color loci, you will definitely find on those loci that there's FSTs that are greater than Wright's crucial value of 0.250,
right,
because those are examples of local adaptation.
Right.
So on one hand, one criterion is the amount of genetic variation within and between populations. That fails in anatomically modern humans. The second criterion is whether we can identify genetically unique lineages within our species. And again, that criterion fails when we look at the amount of gene flow that's existed within our species between, broad continental bases. And so we can't show unique genetic lineages within our species either. So if we use the two criteria by which biologists identify geographical races or subspecies, we don't find that. And again, an evolutionary explanation comes to the fore. It's rather simple. We are a young species that has had a great deal of gene flow through all of its populations through the time in which our species existed. So that doesn't mean that, say, in some far future world, that geographical races might not come into existence, although given the modern technologies of travel and communication, the movement of individuals between continental bases on a large scale, if anything, the amount of subdivision within our species is getting less, not greater.
Oh, sure. Well, actually, this is a question maybe I should know, but an informational question for me is to the genetic diversity in Africa compared to the rest of the world. Because when we look at the geographical scale of local adaptation, my understanding is it's at a much smaller scale than what anyone associates with races. So you're going to find within Africa, for example, a lot of interesting differentiation. Is that right? Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. Sarah Tishkoff, who's probably the foremost anthropologist geneticist who studies genetic variation in sub-Saharan Africa, has shown that there's probably at least 6 sub-Saharan African groups if you were to attempt to cluster the human species. And again, we can do this using algorithms like structure, and we can look at the number of groups that are called out by this algorithm, and you find at least 6 or 7 in sub-Saharan Africa, and then you could count the rest of the world as one.
Yeah.
So the way that I always state this to my students is that if there was an asteroid which destroyed the rest of the world tomorrow and left sub-Saharan Africa untouched, 85% of the genetic variability within our species would be preserved.
Right.
And again, evolution explains to us why that's true. Anatomically modern humans are about 200,000 years old. As far as we can tell, 100,000 of those years were spent in Africa. The first fossil remnants of anyone outside of Africa are around 100,000 years old, and they occur at a site in Israel. So if anatomically modern humans spend at least half of their time in one region of Africa, that's where most of the genetic variation accumulated, simply through time.
Right.
And as small groups left Africa, genetic drift tells us that they won't be carrying the majority of the genetic variation. There'll be a subsample. And so as these groups migrated around the world, they lose genetic variability, as been shown in a variety of other species.
Right.
And so that's why there's more genetic variation in Africa.
Right.
They're the longest.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your own research as a segue to another topic, and that's health and medicine and race. But first, a little bit about what you do as an evolutionist.
Well, I started my work in evolutionary biology on one of the grand problems in evolution. And this was a problem that was outlined first by Peter Medawar in a book called An Unsolved Problem in Biology. And that problem, and I actually am giving Medawar too much credit because actually Alfred Russel Wallace raised this question as well, and he was a contemporary of Charles Darwin. And that question is, well, why do organisms age?
Right.
From an evolutionary point of view, if an organism could continue to live, it should. And so why hasn't natural selection solved this problem? We know that there's huge variations in various species in terms of their lifespan. For example, lake sturgeon have been estimated to live 150 to 200 years. We know that oak trees, like the giant redwoods, for example, can live for close to 1,000 years. We know that there are poplar clones. These are trees in Minnesota that have been aged through 10,000 years. Fungal fairy rings on your lawn may be 3,000 years old.
Right.
Now, these organisms all have the same cell structure. So the approach to aging before our group came along in the mid-'80s, the experimentalists who really unraveled the question that Wallace and Medawar left us, was that there was something going on at the cellular level. There's something going on at the molecular level that's causing aging to occur. And our approach was, well, even if that's true, we still need to address this ultimate question. Why does aging happen? How is it natural selection allow it to happen? And William D. Hamilton, who actually was one of my professors when I was a grad student at Michigan, was the one who gave us the answer. And essentially, he demonstrated mathematically that natural selection must have a declining force with the age of the adult organism. And essentially what that means is that natural selection is really unconcerned about things that happen after the future expected net reproduction has reached zero. Now, in our species, it turns out that age is, in modern times, is around 35 years old. So any gene
that's because of the mortality that took place in the ancestral environment. Is that right? That most people simply didn't live to be much older than that?
Most people didn't live to be 35 years. In fact, even the presence of people that old is relatively recent, sort of late Stone Age. There's real good fossil evidence that suggests that you don't see people living even into their 30s until the late Stone Age. So again, that's around on the order of 10,000, maybe 15,000 years ago. And our species, again, as I said earlier, has been around for 200,000 years. So those are recent developments. So given that fact, anything that happens genetically happens after the age of 35, for the most part, escapes the power of natural selection. Natural selection can't get rid of those genes. And so, therefore, the question becomes, what then are the genetic mechanisms involved in the aging process? And that's sort of where I came into the story in the mid-'80s. Literally, I was the biologist who came in from the cold because I had given up on my graduate career and I was working in the public schools and I was dealing, with underrepresentation, with, poor working conditions. And one day I just got really frustrated and said to myself, I can do more to make a difference if I earn my Ph.D. than if I continue being a high school teacher. So I literally walked out of the school in a cold afternoon in the middle of a snowstorm, walked over to Wayne State and into the office of the graduate advisor, then Bill Moore, who's also an eminent evolutionary biologist, and I told him, I want to finish my PhD. I showed him my transcripts from Michigan, and I said, I want to finish my PhD. What do I need to do to do that? And so he connected me with Leo Luckenbill, who was working on the evolution of aging.
Yeah, right.
And that's when I got into the story. And so the question then was, well, what are the mechanisms? Well, we demonstrated that there are basically two mechanisms that could be at play. One, in which a gene has a beneficial effect early in life, but has a deleterious effect late in life. We call that antagonistic pleiotropy. Pleiotropy means one gene that has multiple effects.
Right.
So it's sort of like turning on a light switch that turns on a bank of lights. So these antagonistic genes may be really useful, in fact, essential to an organism, which means that every member of the species has the gene. But then after the age of post-reproduction, those genes can have all sorts of deleterious effects.
Right.
And probably the one best known to our viewers are the various diseases that we identify as cancer. These genes have an absolutely essential role to play in our development. But if they turn on in post-reproduction and cause uncontrolled cell growth, then they're a disease that can lead to death. And the other mechanism that plays a role is something called mutation accumulation. And that simply is genes that have a neutral effect early in life. And they don't do anything bad. And so those will accumulate in populations by chance. So this is Sewell Wright's genetic drift mechanism again.
Right.
And so populations will have various accumulations of mutations which cause various diseases at late life. Now, that was how we viewed the problem in the mid-'80s. And I did a lot of experiments demonstrating that both of these mechanisms were at work. I particularly worked on the physiology of aging through the flight mechanism in fruit flies. And that's what we thought for many, many years until recently. And now we have demonstrated that it is possible for aging to stop. This is not something that I would have thought was possible in the mid-'80s, even in the early 90s. But a series of experiments starting in the late 90s and the early 2000s have demonstrated that it is possible for an organism living under sufficiently benign conditions for the aging process to essentially cease.
Now, what does that mean? That doesn't mean that nobody dies. It means that they die at the same rate as a function of their age. Is that right?
Well, actually, what happens is that, from the standard Gompertz equation, which shows us that the mortality rate in populations goes up exponentially. So that's what we thought, that, aging is a process that's causing all these bad things to happen, and amongst members of the population, they start dying off past this post-reproductive age, and that rate goes up exponentially. Right. Well, what we've shown now is that there seems to be a mortality plateau. And we've demonstrated, this has been demonstrated in med flies, it's been demonstrated in fruit flies by one of my former undergraduate students, who was working in the Michael Rose's lab, that you can in fact have a very long period of time in which the Gompertz equation has a flat slope. In other words, the rate of mortality within that population doesn't go up.
So a certain proportion is dying at every age, but that proportion stays the same.
But
right?
the proportion stays the same. In other words, it is possible to reach a stage in life in which you could live for a very long time, which the organism could live for a very long time, before it eventually succumbs to some age-related disease.
Now, that's an empirical result, but does it have a theoretical rationale?
Yes, absolutely. Both series of studies have shown that you can get this aging plateau through the action of antagonistic pleiotropy, that you can get it also through mutation accumulation, specifically if those mutation accumulation effects have any sort of time delay. So there have been two really good experiments and a bunch of theory now that illustrate to us that the late life mortality plateau is a real thing.
Wow. Okay, now let's segue here to the more general topic of health, especially diet. I'm fascinated with the concept of the Paleolithic diet, and we feature that quite often on the magazine. I know that both Michael Rose and you are advocates of the Paleolithic diet. So I might interesting to hear about your own personal experience. But then, in general, the idea that there's enough variation among the races so that this has medicinal consequences, health consequences, and why that might be. That's a lot to throw at you, actually. But
yeah, that's a lot. But again, this is a fundamental aspect of evolution. Evolution results in this thing called adaptation. Now, we've just authored a paper for a journal called Frontiers in Genetics, in which we're now problematizing the whole notion of aging. And of course, this is my wife calling, but I'm going to let her wait because we're doing this interview. Because actually, interesting story. My son is in New England today, auditioning at the New England Conservatory of Music.
Oh, congratulations!
And of course, you're talking about underrepresentation, which we'll get to at the end of the day. Just last week, he was at the Peabody in Baltimore, which is associated with Johns Hopkins, and he met a janitor who was working there, and he said in all his time at the Peabody, he'd never once seen an African-American student audition for admission in piano.
Really?
Yeah, and it literally brought tears to his eyes. And again, this will come back when we talk about this underrepresentation stuff later. But going back to what we're talking about now, which is this notion that there's adaptation to an organism's environment. We are viewing what people call aging as actually the detuning of adaptation, which results from Hamilton's fundamental dictum that the force of natural selection falls at late age. So while you are in the time period in which you're reproducing, natural selection has the power to provide adaptations that help you do what you need to do. But once you're past that age, natural selection couldn't adapt you to that.
Right.
So this is both in a case of the detuning of adaptation, and then also in a sense, it's another one of the topics that I've been working on lately. It's also a mismatch, an evolutionary mismatch. Because
that's a project that we're working on together through NESIN, mismatch, evolutionary mismatch, and what to do about it.
Right. Because, as you pointed out earlier in our conversation, people didn't live this long in our previous environments. And so now this notion of living past this age of last reproduction is something that's new and which we have no adaptations for.
Right.
So now, how does this come back to diet? Well, we, in the history of our species, and this is also true of closely related primates, we had a certain sort of diet. And that diet consisted of sort of meats of various forms, vegetables, in the sense I'm talking about leafy green things that we found edible, roots and tubers, storage organs, and also, other kinds of plants that we found and we tried and, weren't too bitter, so we ate them. So these
don't forget fruits and nuts.
Yeah, fruits and nuts. Yeah, so those are the things that we ate. So around 10,000 years ago, we picked up the cultivation of specific groups of plants, and here, from our point of view, we think that probably one of the most dangerous groups of plants that we cultivated were plants of the grass family, and in particular because these things tend to have contribute to the imbalance of omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids in our bodies, and that imbalance is related to inflammation, and inflammation is at the root of a number of late-life diseases, including heart disease, cancer, diabetes, and so on. So what we're arguing is that if we were to change our diet in such a way that we were to reduce the omega-3, omega-6 imbalance, and whatever that is, if you want to call it Paleolithic, you can call it that. But the key thing is having a diet which changes the balance of omega-3, omega-6 in the neighborhood of 1-to-1 so that we reduce inflammation, which will then reduce the onset of all these late-age diseases, which we have no adaptations to address. That's the idea behind what we're saying.
And so does it really hang around the omega-3, omega-6, or is there a greater diversity of problems?
There probably is, and this is the difficulty in that, from an experimentalist point of view, it's hard to know
right.
What all the various sources are, because particularly when we also throw in another portion of our evolutionary perspective, that is novel environment, we're also throwing in all sorts of compounds that we had no exposure to that are playing a role. Things like, polychlorinated biphenyls.
Yeah, there's a whole cocktail.
All sorts of other stuff that are hormone disruptors and endocrine disruptors. So it's going to be really difficult for us to get a handle on what's safe to eat. We sort of have a sense of what we shouldn't be eating, and for reasons I've just mentioned. But in the other side of the coin, which is now what is safe to eat, my argument would be stuff that's not processed, that has as few novel chemicals in it as possible, things that have antioxidants, because a lot of the damage that occurs in late life is due to oxidizing compounds, things that reduce inflammation. Those would be my sort of general statements as to what you should eat, and what those things are. It's not entirely clear.
Well, what's your personal experience, and is there any reason why African Americans should suffer from these kinds of problems in any different way than white Americans?
All right. In terms of the sort of impact for different population groups, the argument would be you should be eating the things that your ancestors ate. Now, since persons of African descent were from the tropics, they wouldn't have been eating wheat. And as you know, there's all sorts of material coming out now, all sorts of studies demonstrating the devastating effect that wheat-based foods are having on a variety of populations. Our argument would be for people from the tropics, and again, this is again not a racial argument,
right,
as people would see it.
right. Right.
It's people who didn't live in in wheat producing zones.
Right.
So that would be true of Central Americans, it would be true of Central Africans, it would be true of Indians, it would be true of Southeast Asians. It would be true of Pacific Islanders. In fact, one of the things that we've noticed with a lot of Pacific Islanders is this sudden shift in their aging from being really fit, beautiful individuals when they were young, but now eating the Western diet, and particularly women from those islands, increasing their weight tremendously in their post-reproductive period. And that's not something that occurred before. So I think it's, again, another example of novel environment.
Yeah.
So the take-home message here is, if you can find out what region you came from, eating foods that were domesticated in your region is probably your best bet. But even then, we're still talking about only 10,000 years.
Is there evidence that Asians who subsisted on rice can't deal with wheat and vice versa? Because I seldom hear about the negative effects of rice, but is it the case that depending on who your ancestors came from, that rice might be not so good to eat?
I think rice is probably going to come out okay. I know my colleague Michael Rose would probably say no, but I'm gonna sort of disagree with him on this. And it's the reason why is because of the way rice is processed. If you eat white rice, it's basically just starch. I mean, virtually everything has been processed out of it.
Right.
And so I can't see how that's going to hurt you. It's just a source of starch, just like, and in a sense, you would probably argue that potatoes that have their skins on them are probably more dangerous than rice because, as you know, the Solanaceae contain a whole bunch of noxious compounds.
Well,
so
it's also the case that our ancestors, they ate a whole bunch of stuff that was toxic as hell. That's why we have livers. So it's not as if that our ancestral diet was free of toxins. But
sure, I completely agree with you there. And so I think we're going to have to sort of take an empirical approach with given plants and ask yourself, well, what's in them? And when you look at white rice, it sort of seems like it's okay. Now, I will mention that there's been an epidemic of obesity and diabetes throughout Southeast Asia. And that is definitely linked with the introduction of processed wheat-based foods coming from the West. So clearly is another example of a novel environment that is creating sickness in an area of the region of the world that didn't have those foods before.
Right. Okay. Now, briefly, if you don't mind, could you just share your own experience, and then I'm going to proceed to my final question with this great interview.
My own experience has been that I was close probably to death 6 months ago. I was, really bad shape in terms of what I was eating. And I was eating all the wrong Western processed foods. And, again, I have to give my colleague Michael Rose credit for this. He took one look at me and said, Joe, if you don't change your diet, you're going to be dead in 6 months. And so I took his suggestion. I changed my diet. I got rid of the wheat in particular. I started eating leafy green vegetables, tubers like, sweet potatoes and potatoes. And immediately inflammation-related disease subsided. So I had really bad bursitis. That all went away. I lost 60 pounds in less than 2 months. So from my own personal experience, changing to a diet that is probably more in line with my ancestry, which, by the way, is not only African, but European and American Indian as well, has probably saved my life.
Yeah. Okay, great. And that's one of the things we hope to do is we want to start an Evos diet, as you know, and we'll be reporting that topic quite a bit on Evolution, This View of Life. Well, Joe, I want to finish up with a question of why is it that blacks are underrepresented in science and evolution in particular?
Well, we have to start with the first point that I always make is that African Americans are underrepresented in every professional field, not just science.
Right.
So we have to start from there. But then within the sciences, there are definitely certain trends of underrepresentation, with evolution being probably the most underrepresented field.
All right.
And I would argue that, historically, from what we know, I'm the first African American to ever receive a Ph.D. in this field, and that was in 1988, which wasn't that long ago.
Right.
And there have still been very few since me, so we probably can count the number of African Americans in evolutionary biology on two hands. If there's more than 10, I'd be really surprised.
Wow.
So what is it? I think it's in part the fact that African Americans have a history of being the most religious people in the United States. African Americans have adopted particularly Christianity, more so than European Americans. And certainly if you look at our history and you look at the two populations in terms of acting like Christians, I would say African Americans certainly acted like Christians more than European Americans did. But, that's a whole nother discussion. But having said that, having this fervent belief system, and it's a very fundamentalist one. So it's a notion that the things that are in the Christian Bible are literally true. So most African Americans do not question the notion of a 7-day creation. The idea that species were created in their kind. Those are things that they don't question.
And you taught at a largely black college for most of your career, right? So you have a lot of experience that way.
Actually, for most of my career, I was at majority European American institutions. It's only been recently that I've been at historically black colleges.
Okay.
And in the historically black colleges, that's exactly what you find. I mean, you find that students have a great deal of faith, and they're very distrustful of science in general because it contradicts things that they have taken to be true by faith. So, and my argument is unless people in evolutionary biology understand that, there's never going to be a whole lot of headway made towards attracting African Americans to evolutionary biology. So, on one hand, I know people who sort of just dismiss these faith-based beliefs and ridicule them. And I would argue that that kind of attitude is never going to attract African Americans into the field. It's one thing to have a disagreement, and I happen to myself be a Christian, but I'm not a biblical literalist and I'm not a fundamentalist. And I actually don't think that we can use religion to understand nature, period. That just happens to be my view. And that's how I can be an evolutionary biologist. But if I were to go around ridiculing people because of their faith, there's absolutely no way I would be able to talk to them.
Right.
And hence no means of recruiting them and helping them understand that evolution actually has a great deal to offer in terms of solving many of the social justice type questions that African Americans have been interested and concerned with.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. We hope to interview Jim Sidanius also during Black History Month. But of course, there's much to be said there. Well, Joe, this has been great. Is there anything you'd like to add to finish up our interview?
No, I think this has been a really good interview, good conversation, and I enjoyed having it with you.
Okay, great. Well, in that case, this is David Sloan Wilson signing off for Evolution, This View of Life. Thanks a lot, Joe.